And I see that we've been joined by Jaswinder. Jaswinder, welcome to this afternoon's session. You're here with us in Nairobi. Well, you're based in Nairobi. I don't know if you're Nairobi right now, but if you are, I'll give you a few minutes, of course, to introduce yourself to our listeners today. Although I will say that you are the chair of the Kenya Export Promotion and Branding Agency. But if you could just tell our listeners today a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into the questions because I have quite a number. So please go ahead, Jaswinder, and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind invitation, which I graciously accepted in my very hectic schedule. But as you're aware, as you introduced me, I am the chair of the Kenya Export Promotion and Branding Agency. But besides that, I run my own businesses. I'm in the cotton, textile, and apparel value chain. We have our own plantations of growing cotton for us in Uganda, and we run the whole value chain from field to fashion. We export garments to the US from Kenya, and we're running a similar operation in Kenya as well. So we export to free trade agreement. This huge opportunity ahead of us with 1.2 billion people and $3.5 trillion economy. So really looking forward to what's up and what's next.
That's fantastic. I mean, I like the fact that I like that phrase, or field to fashion. The fact that you are working across the entire supply chain is pretty remarkable. But you also do find that in, we won't get into the specifics of that, but I remember reading a couple of years ago about how textile and apparel is such a huge potential sector, especially for East Africa. So it's good to hear that that is already happening, that you've got the growing in one country, the manufacturing in another, and then you've got, the whole world that you can supply. But going back to your role under the Kenya Export Promotion and Branding Agency, could you share with us a little bit about the opportunities that you see for African businesses to export more, and not just necessarily in the textile and apparel sector, but what you're seeing right now as sort of like the growth areas when it comes to manufacturing on the continent and exporting value-added products across the world?
Okay, just to give you a little brief on Kenya's exports. Textile and apparel exports today from Kenya are the third largest export. Number one being horticulture, floriculture. Number two being tea. As at last year, tea was, during COVID, was our number one export. And the apparel business at the moment is number three. It's overtaken coffee. It's a $500 million business. But as much as we chest thump that we're the largest exporter of apparel from the region, Sub-Saharan Africa, it's only 0.5% of the US market. The US market is $100 billion. We are duty-free like many other African countries under the AGOA legislation. But sometimes, I say shame on us that we're only doing 0.5% of the US pie. The size of the pie is huge, and our slice of the pie is it's a needle in the haystack. To give you an example, on a comparative note, Bangladesh, a small country like Kenya, their exports are $50 billion. They were supposed to hit their $50 billion mark in 2025. They actually hit them in 2021. So it just tells you the huge scope in this business and the amount of jobs that it can create. So the government is very clear. The Kenya government, we're now building a lot more factories. There's a new realization in the world. Realization about supply chains and global supply chains as we speak are getting reorganized. A couple of reasons why this is happening. One is, of course, post-COVID, we had a very strong rebound factor. And also the market access that we have to Europe and to US is duty-free, quota-free. It gives us a competitive and comparative advantage. Now, why are we looking more at the US market as opposed to the European market? Simply, the case is simple. The tariff into the US is very high. It's 16% on cotton goods and 32% on polyester goods. So if you're doing a polyester garment, for every $3 your customer gets that dollar back. So it gives you a huge competitive advantage against Asia, that is Vietnam and China and Bangladesh and Laos, Cambodia. So we have a serious competitive advantage in high tariff business. To Europe, unfortunately, we're not exporting a lot. And the reason is simple, that Europe is duty-free, not only to Africa and most African countries, but it's also duty-free to LDC Asia. LDC Asia is countries like Bangladesh, which have since graduated. So they're also enjoying a duty-free market access to Europe, and they're super competitive. So the duty into Europe on apparel is 8 to 12%. So it's not very high. The extra cost of doing business in Africa actually choose that advantage. So it makes you not so competitive. Okay, then if you look at other value chains, I see opportunity everywhere. I see opportunity in the tea sector in Kenya. And to just give you an example, Kenya grows 450 million kilos of tea, and our export revenue is $1.4 billion. If you compare that with Sri Lanka, they grow 300 million kilos of tea, which is 50% less than ours, and their export revenue is $3.4 billion. And then you ask yourself, what is going wrong here? I mean, why are we earning so little? And it's a very simple answer. We're not doing value-added teas, and all we're doing is Majani chai, just black tea. And it doesn't, we don't brand our tea. So as the agency, we have been mandated now by the president that, listen, guys, it's about time that we do a lot more value addition. It's about time that on the continent we capture the value. And it's not only in tea, it's the same in, like I talked about cotton just now. You look at the same, it's in cocoa. We export 95% of our cocoa and we import chocolates, right? And the same in coffee, we will sell coffee beans, and then we will import roasted beans, or we'll sell that same cup in Starbucks at $3, and the farmer is only getting 3 cents of that cup. So I think there's a fundamental shift on the continent. The continent is looking at value addition, and the continent is looking at how can we maximize that raw material that we're so used to extractive industries. We grow and export, and our whole infrastructure over the last 150 years has been built to grow in Africa and export primary. And I think that narrative needs to change, and that's what we're trying to do at KEPROBA, where I am chair at the moment. And I have a tall order. I mean, I was looking at English breakfast tea. There's nothing English about it. There's not a single bush in England, and all of us drink English breakfast tea. And when I did a deep dive, and why is it called English breakfast tea, and why can't, and what is the recipe of English breakfast tea? I realized that the recipe is the British Raj. Basically, it is 1 kilo Assam from India, 1 kilo Ceylon from Sri Lanka, and 1 kilo Kericho from Kenya. And I asked the guys, why do you need a Kenyan component? Why don't you just blend it in with the 2 Asian countries and sell it as English breakfast tea? And the guy said, sorry, we can't do that. I said, why not? And this is a big company, and I think you know who I'm talking about. And they said, the Kenyan component is crucial. I said, why? They said, because Kenyan component, that 1/3 blend that we put into the English breakfast tea gives us aroma and it gives us color. So if aroma and color are so important in a cup of tea, why are we not maximizing that value advantage that we already have? So lots of examples, lots of opportunities, yes. And I can keep talking on and on and on, but I think I need to pause there because I'm sure you have more questions for me.
That's, I mean, you are talking right now about all these competitive advantages that we have, especially on the continent, right? And closer to home here in Kenya with the examples that you gave us. Continentally, we look at our neighbors, perhaps like Ethiopia, and you have in Ethiopia, they have geographic indicators for their main products, which is coffee. And so you have a requirement that if you are sourcing coffee from a particular region, when that region is stated, when it's over a certain volume and that region is stated, that geographic indicator must be identified. And it is something that the Ethiopian government has patented at the WTO. So when you talk about Ethiopian coffee coming from the Sidama region or coming from the Oromia region, there are those legal requirements that protect the product, that also bring additional revenue to the country. And I was just wondering whether that is something that we are looking into as Kenya, because very often you would find that People are talking about having, Kenyan tea, or calling it Kenya Safari, or talking about having Kenyan coffee, and yet very little of Kenyan coffee has been, or a Kenyan product has been used in the total makeup of that particular recipe. So it would be interesting to just hear your thoughts on that, and whether that is something that you're seeing in different parts of the continent. The same way that the Champagne region says any sparkling wine that comes from there is the only one that's called champagne. Anyone else who's growing the same grapes cannot call it champagne. So do we have something similar like that happening in our sectors, in which we have we have an exceptional product, and how are we presenting that product to the world?
Well, I think it's all to do with intellectual property, and that's what you're talking about. And yes, in the past we have lost the brand Kyondo to the Japanese, and it's it's a basket that these SMEs are actually weaving. And also the Kikoi brand was under threat with somebody registering it in the UK. So I think by and large, we hardly protect our intellectual property, and that is what we're trying to do now, and we're trying to get a bit more careful. And if you look at, you talked about how can we identify our products differently. I think as the branding agency, we are now taking that as a lead position. We're trying to tell the world that there is a difference. And most of us are now going for value propositions as opposed to selling propositions. So if you ask me, what is your USP? I'll be polite in telling you we don't have a USP. And I think you know where to go for a USP, because those countries just sell, sell, sell. But we're coming to a situation we want to move a USP to a UVP, meaning what is your unique value proposition? So I'll give you an example. In the cotton space, I've got, in my own plantations, we're doing a brand called Cotton Made in Africa. Laura Chaplin, who's the granddaughter of Charlie Chaplin, she's our brand ambassador. So we're trying to use strong brand ambassadors, trying to talk about traceability, trying to talk about sustainability, because all the supply chains in the world today, everybody wants a component of sustainability. You've seen what's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh with COP27, and the whole new value proposition is about traceability, sustainability, circularity, and verticality. And I think that's where we're taking Kenya into a new position. We've got 93% of our energy mix is now renewable energy. And if we can put that into your shirt, and if you have a label at the back of your shirt saying that this shirt is used making green energy, straight away it should actually help you sell more, because the world is getting a little bit more conscious. Every consumer, and it's got to be consumer driven. Tomorrow's consumer is very different to yesterday's consumer. Yesterday's consumer wanted price. Tomorrow's consumer wants value. It's a big difference between price and value.
But again, going back to this question of how can we create African brands that can go out there and conquer the world. Jaswinder, what do you think we need to do to do that?
Thank you. I think time has come that we start selling our identity as opposed to selling somebody's identity. And English breakfast tea is a classical example, which is nothing English about it. But yes, we all drink it very proudly every morning and say, wow, I'm drinking English breakfast tea. So what does Africa need to do, and how do we change the narrative? I think we need to start branding the continent. We need to start branding Africa. We need to start having a deliberate plan of buying African. And that's the time we will actually build Africa. So the 3 Bs, right? Brand, buy, build. And really, that's what we need to do. And you will start seeing all of a sudden, I mean, you can see today, Louis Vuitton the other day they were actually showcasing a Masai Shuka as their new collection. To me, that's my intellectual property. Masai Shuka is very Kenyan, and it should have had a Kenyan twist to it. So as we start getting more and more protective with our intellectual property, I mean, look at Safaricom and M-Pesa, for example. I mean, the whole world knows that M-Pesa was a creation by some Kenyans who really could not be bothered to go home and give their grandmother money every weekend because it was an issue, right? So they adopted technology and innovation. And I think it was then rolled out globally. The brand, of course, in different countries is called different, but it's the same thing. It's M-Pesa. But did Kenya get the dividend, the innovation dividend? No, because we sold it on to our shareholders in Safaricom, who are Vodacom, who then sold it on to the entire world. So we need to be a little bit careful with the small print in all the joint ventures that we do. And if there is any discovery due to innovation like M-Pesa, then surely we need dividend. We need innovation dividend, we need brand dividend, and we need to start very strongly talking about our brands and starting building companies which are strong brands. And I think it's not impossible. I mean, the rest of the world, most of them don't have the resource that we have. We are the richest planet and yet the poorest planet, purely because we've not added value on our primary raw materials, and that narrative is changing fast. We have a young continent, the average maiden age of 19, and you can see what a young population can do to mobilize. We are more technological savvy than anybody else I know on the continent. I mean, I was speaking to some people in Washington in an AGOA forum setting, and I told them, guys, you know, our grandmothers are so intelligent, they buy 2 kilos of potatoes on a phone. And I think our grandmothers are more intelligent than yours. I mean, I was joking. And the guy said, what are you saying? How can you be so blunt? And I said, I don't think your grandmother knows how to do an SMS. My grandmother buys 1 kilo of potatoes in the village on a digital platform. So, surely speaking, it tells you that our way of doing business is very different. I mean, we're now all talking on this digital platform, but we're connecting the entire continent and the entire world. So there's so much to do and so little time, and all of us need to just start running and say, guys, let's move on and let's create the strong African brands which everybody wants.
Absolutely. I like that what you said about brand, buy, and build. But let's make sure that we answer this question that was put here on the chat. And one attendee is asking, what kind of green energy is used for manufacturing? And what's the cost of this energy? Jaswinder, would you like to touch on that? Because I think you raised the question of the renewables in Kenya.
Yeah, well, I've already answered that question. It's largely solar and geothermal from Olkaria, where we're getting this steam coming out of the ground. So that's all renewable energy. We have 10,000 megawatts in there. Yes, the cost of solar is a bit high, and the cost of renewables are a little high. But then look at the cost of fossil fuels and the price that we are paying. We've just had 2.5 million cattle livestock who have died in northern Kenya because of a drought and because of climate change. So which cost is lower? You know, the long-term cost of climate change is far higher than the short-term high cost of solar, renewable. So in the long term, if you actually look at it in terms of impact to the planet, and I think we're all becoming tree huggers, as I would call it, and we really need to start thinking different. And that's the value proposition I'm talking about. If I tell you today that you got a newborn baby, please don't use normal cotton t-shirts and baby wear. Use organic baby wear. And the reason I give you is that organic baby wear will not give your newborn baby any skin rash. I put fear into you. So the most powerful tool of marketing is fear. And if I charge you $10 for that t-shirt or that baby wear, as opposed to $5, which is what you would have paid for a normal one, you'd actually pick that more expensive one, because I've actually told you the advantage of going organic cotton as opposed to going conventional cotton. So when you sell a story, and I think every product that Africa does, we need to start storytelling. We are very bad at storytelling, and marketing and branding is all about storytelling. And without storytelling, you can actually, price becomes a significant second pointer and not the primary pointer. The primary pointer becomes the story.
I mean, and that's
the point of sale. I mean,
yes, and you know, I think that's something that we need to go back to, right? Because for sure, across the continent, in all the cultures, whether they are the storytelling is at the heart of everything. Yeah, there's such oral history, whether it is in music or in actually just telling those stories, that history, those fables. All of that goes back to the story. So how do we, as you said, how do we capsulize that yeah, and use it
Absolutely.
to tell that brand story of African brands and what it is that we are giving to the world, and what is it that we are sharing with the rest of the world, in as much as even in just how we do business, as you pointed out. You know, Kenya has over 95% of our grid energy is renewable energy. I think that there are very few, I don't know whether there are any other countries in the world that can say that that's where they are with that, especially when it does come to the grid. Jaswinder, what is your parting shot to us today?
Well, my parting shot would be that, and I have used this even yesterday when President Ramaphosa, we had this business forum, Kenya and South Africa, because we're trying to increase the trade. And as you know, from 1st January, Kenyans will be allowed to go to South Africa visa-free. So we, as a continent, have so much in common. And unfortunately, we put a lot of barriers of trade, all sorts of things. And I can give you lots of stories, but there's one story that I would like to share. It happened to me in 2011 in Zambia. I was at the AGOA Forum, and I was fortunate enough to actually have dinner with Secretary of State at that time, Hillary Clinton. And there was a Zambian minister called Felix Mutati. And we ordered a steak for dinner, and the first bite of that steak in Secretary of State was, wow, amazing steak. This is what she said, Hillary Clinton. And this is a true story. And I kicked the minister under the table, and he started looking at me. He said, yeah, Zambian steak is very good. And so I'm very happy. And I pulled him aside later on. I said, Minister, what did the Secretary of State of the United States say? She said, amazing steak. I said, yes. But what does that mean? He says, no, we have beef, good beef. I said, hey, hold on. You're missing the point here. Tomorrow morning, we've got the AGOA Forum starting. Right now, African beef under phytosanitary rules of origin and health and safety is not allowed into the US. And this is your opportunity, because what is good for your Secretary of State should be good for 300 million Americans. You can't put your Secretary of State's life in danger if 300 million Americans are going to be protected. So that was it. He made that statement in the AGOA Forum, and the very next day, they actually removed those barriers of entry, because it's one thing giving you market access, but there's the other thing that you have a non-tariff barrier stopping that access. And that gave Zambian beef a market into the US market. But going back to what I also like to say, the problem with us in Africa, we're all pygmies. All of us are pygmies, and President Museveni uses this all the time. And we are trying to see who is the taller pygmy. We should stop competing with each other and start complementing each other, so that you can build world-class companies and world-class operations. And that will only happen once we look at each other as complementers and not competitors. So that, to me, is a fundamental shift in paradigm we need to have. We have 1.3 billion Africans on the continent today. We will be 2 billion in the year 2040. We are the fastest and youngest growing continent in the world. And you know what? We are soon, with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we are the single biggest economic trading bloc in the world. So let's do it.